Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I must admit I was very surprised to get the invitation. I first came into contact with Microfinance Centre back actually in February 1999 at a meeting in Sarajevo. And many of the points I raised then I'm raising now. So for some people I'll be repeating a few things. So I've kept in touch with them and looked at what they're doing. So as I say, I'm very glad to be back here and to be able to say what I want to say, which was important as well. I don't want to come and say all nice things if I don't actually mean them. I've got 10 to 12 minutes to just go through. And have we got the slides on? We don't. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if we are. They're coming up. They're coming up. Okay. Well, I mean, there we go. So, I mean, my presentation is basically... My presentation is basically about the downsides to a particular financial innovation where, working as a local economic development consultant for quite a few years as an academic researcher as well, I end up with some serious problems. I think there's a fatal flaw in the concept of microfinance because economic history does not have any evidence to show that the proliferation of micro-enterprises and self-employment has any connection to sustainable poverty reduction and sustainable bottom-up development. Now that's absolutely crucial. There's much evidence for that through histories. Countries that develop escape that particular economic structure. They don't actually proliferate it. We've seen this in the Western economies. We've also seen this in the East Asian economies. So there's a conceptual flaw there at the heart of microfinance. So sustainable development and poverty reduction actually requires a much more complicated and complex set of organizations and institutional structures. And we need to be building those particular type of structures if we're really interested in addressing poverty and creating local employment. And the problem with that, the problem with microfinance, is that in many cases the proliferation of microfinance and microenterprises actually blocks or frustrates these other types of institutions and organizations. So that's the problem I have, because if they could coexist some way, then it wouldn't be such a bad thing, that some could go off and do microfinance and microenterprises and others can be doing other things. But in many cases, it's one or the other. There's an opportunity cost there. So I think I agree with, and I've worked with the Cambridge economist Ha-Joon Chang, certainly recommend his recent book. He talks about microfinance and microenterprises as a poverty trap that countries need to overcome to move out of those. And he uses Africa as an example of a country where just about everybody is an entrepreneur. But that's part of the problem. That's something that the country has to overcome in order to move on to sustainable poverty reduction. So the other issue that we need to look at is that most economies, most local economies, have been saturated with the sorts of simple things that microfinance actually proliferates. The typical, the shoe shines, the vegetable sellers, the mobile phone time sellers, those sorts of things have been around for a long time. And simply cramming more into the local economy through price effects has negative implications for the local economy. In all the major countries where we have a surplus, if you like, of microfinance, we actually see prices softening, margins softening, wages softening, people actually going backwards, not moving forward. One of the issues there was the misunderstanding that Professor Yunus had, that if he looked at one particular seller of baskets and then assumed that if everybody in the village made baskets, wow, this looks as though everybody will be employed. If you can understand the flaw in that reasoning, then you understand why it wasn't a good idea to go forward. And another problem that we've noticed recently is the very high failure rate of small businesses in general, but particularly poverty push micro-enterprises. And the problem with that is that it opens up the problem of people losing other assets as well as having to repay a loan where they have no income to actually repay it. Okay, so that's the problem with the concept of microfinance. Moving on to what really came in the last 20 years when the Washington institutions intervened and said, well, the poor, we want to help them, but we want them to pay for any escape from poverty. We don't want any of the business elites or the middle class to pay, the poor must pay. So that means you have to commercialise microfinance, turn it into a business. I think most of us here, and my discussions already with some people, is that's a disaster. That's been a complete disaster. It's turned what could have been something that was positive into something that really is a disaster. It started in Bolivia, no evidence to show that there's been any positive effect from microfinance, and then it all blew up. We then have Morocco, Pakistan, Nicaragua, Bosnia. Most of my consulting has been in Bosnia. I'm very familiar with the country. It's been a real sad story how it all blew up, and then it all blew up and exploded, and it'll take years for the country to get over it. I was also asked to speak very quickly about the Andhra Pradesh crisis. I'm doing a bit of writing on that, and I'll be visiting in the summer to talk about it. Very clearly, it was commercialisation driven by the commercial banks who were financing the MFIs, and driven by, and let's be quite honest about this, the greed of the MFIs. There's no doubt about that. They were involved in making several tens, in some cases $60, $70 million. This has turned into a business where there's no real connection with poverty reduction anymore if you look at what's been going on there. Now, one of the issues in terms of regulation was there was a mini crisis around 2005-06, but of course the regulators were told keep away by the microfinance institutions, which were getting very rich and powerful at that stage, and of course they kept away, and then the whole dynamic started again, and of course it blew up completely in 2010. I was also asked, so who's next? Well, one of the things positive, I don't know, about being a critic is that people always send you stuff that you don't actually ask for. Hidden notes, emails, all sorts of things, and from what I can gather from all this stuff and conversations, Bangladesh I would be seriously worried about. There is some real problems there. Peru, I've been in touch with, I had a few phone calls this week, is another area which is overheating, and which is a bit more relevant here. Armenia is one area which I've been hearing from several friends that is in danger. My last 2 minutes, I was also asked, okay, what's the lessons for crisis hit Europe? Because Western Europe apparently is now discovering this thing and starting to look. Well, I was asked, what are the sort of things I see as useful in terms of poverty reduction and local development? I don't think there's any doubt about some of the things that we know actually do work. We know that simple cash grants and conditional cash transfers have been very useful at ameliorating the worst effects of poverty. We have independent evaluations, and I stress independent, not done by CGAP or World Bank or something like that, but independent evaluations which show that these are working quite well. If you want consumption credit, which a lot of the poor now use microfinance for consumption credit, I think it's John Hatch that said up to 90%, but we know in most countries it's between 70 to 80 to 90%, then you just need to join a credit union. I live in Croatia, I'm a member of a local credit union. I get 2% on any money, I take loans out at 12% if I need them. There doesn't seem to be a problem with those sorts of things. Another thing that the EU needs to be very worried about is because Latin America is now discovering real problems with microfinance. There's a fantastic book just out called The Age of Productivity, and it was the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank's flagship book for 2010, and it was very negative, and it said that Latin America's 30 years of poverty and deprivation was as a result of intermediating too much finance into micro-enterprises and self-employment, and not enough into small and medium enterprises with real innovation, technology use, export potential, non-local market access potential. Wow. Wow, that's a mainstream organisation coming up with a result like that. So it's very interesting, and I'm now working in Colombia, and we're hoping to get some of those people to come down and have a look at that. We already have some big problems in the EU in terms of local displacement and failure. We see communities that they have enough hairdressers, they have enough shoe shines, they have all those things now. The problem in those things isn't that we need more of them, we need to cut them back, or we need to help these guys to scale up or develop. It's not to add to them. It's only going to make their situation worse. But we're seeing this now in the Cameron government, that they want to develop a new form of microfinance in the poorest regions to develop shoe shine operations and vegetables. Total disaster. Yep, one more minute. I've just got 2 more points. So the basic reason I'm looking at some microfinance institutions in different countries, and one of my big recommendations is that you have to really deal with the missing middle. The small and medium enterprises that have non-local markets, that have innovation, that have growth potential. However difficult it is to work with those enterprises, it is very difficult. We need to really focus attention, technical support and finance onto those. And there's a realization that the missing middle is the problem in Africa, it's the problem in Latin America, so that is coming. If we need to develop new financial institutions, we should learn from the Chinese, the Taiwanese and the South Koreans. They know how to get the governance issues right. So they know how to develop institutions which in many cases are state-owned or public-private partnerships, but they work. And my final point is just on agriculture, because there is this issue of the food crisis, and I think where microfinance has inserted itself into agriculture, in most cases it's been pretty much a disaster. So there's a recognition that farming needs to go back to the idea of finance which is adaptable, which is suitable for agriculture, not simply finance that can pay its own way. I've said far too much in a short space of time. I hope you got some of that, and I'm very interested in your views and how we might exchange views. Thanks.